Evelyn Zumaya reads AffairsValentino.
I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of AffairsValentino, and I want to read my book to you. Chapter 2. Opportunity Knocks on Room A4. Hollywood, 2 years later, November 6th, 1919. It was just after 4 a.m. when guests of the Hollywood Hotel began grumbling in their broken sleep. The sound of a man's angry shouting in one of the hotel's hallways was shattering all hope of any peaceful night's rest. A few pajama-clad heroes stumbled out of bed and headed in the direction of the commotion to issue a perfunctory, "Hey, pipe down!" But their demands were ignored, as the source of the ruckus continued slamming his fist on the door of his new bride's hotel suite. Rudolph Valentino found himself in this frustrating predicament only a few hours after his marriage to actress Jean Acker. Just as she and her new husband were about to enter their hotel bridal suite, she panicked and slammed the door in his face. While he protested, Mrs. Rudolph Valentino refused to crack the door in the slightest, fearing that Rudy, as she called him, would burst through any opening and consummate his wedding night right then and there. To the exasperation of nearby hotel guests, it didn't appear the bride was about to have a change of heart. It was only after the hotel's night manager threatened the irate bridegroom with a call to the police that anyone on the floor was able to doze off again. Abandoning his strong-armed seduction of his bride, Rudy slumped down to the hallway floor to sit with his back pressed against Jean's door. He had not doubted her sincerity when she agreed to marry him a few days earlier, and had no idea what prompted her to suddenly slam on the brakes. To make matters worse, their wedding took place only a few short hours earlier, before a room full of friends and Metro Picture executives. In the wee hours of the following morning, fledgling actor Rudy Valentino struggled to comprehend the awful turn of events. At the time of his engagement, Metro Pictures issued an official press release announcing the marriage of their contract actress Miss Jean Acker to an unknown bit player, Rudolph Valentino, previously known as Rudolpho Valentino. The studio's treasurer, Joseph Engels, hosted the ceremony in his home, and Metro's general manager, Maxwell Carger, witnessed the ceremony from the groom's side and signed the marriage certificate. After the brief ceremony, the entire wedding party celebrated at the Hollywood Hotel, where Metro Pictures spared no expense on a raucous party. The wedding guests devoured an extravagant buffet and danced until dawn to the strains of a full orchestra. At some point during the evening, the happy couple slipped away from the festivities and headed for their suite. But instead of leaping into her husband's arms to be carried over the threshold, Jean jilted her hubby with all the finesse of a swift kick in the pants. For a few minutes, Rudy attributed his wife's disturbing behavior to a simple case of wedding night jitters. But like any other warm-blooded bridegroom, he'd made his own plans for the night, and they did not include standing alone in a hotel hallway. When his bellowing failed, he resorted to pounding on the door. Before surrendering to his ignoble situation, bridegroom Rudy issued one last appeal, only to hear Jean's tired voice call out, "Please, Rudy, I have to work tomorrow. I'll call you." Accepting what he hoped to be only a temporary rejection, Rudy began a slow march home towards his own modest apartment. Jean's reaction was not the only wound to his dignity that morning. He had no car in which to make a speedy getaway, and he was wearing brand-new patent leather shoes which were about to scuff and grind on a long walk home. Instead of spending his first morning as a married man languishing in his wife's arms, he was about to trudge home alone with ample time to reflect upon the most recent events in his life. It seemed he had been searching for the perfect wife to provide him with a home and children for far too long. He knew it had become common knowledge among Hollywood's single movie starlets that he never refused an invitation for a home-cooked meal. The Gish sisters, Dorothy and Lillian, invited him to their home for lavish meals in order to vie for his attention. Actress Pauline Frederick and her mother countered those efforts with even more mouth-watering enticements and doting female companionship. On the previous Christmas Eve, screen star Viola Dana invited Rudy to join in her family's holiday celebration. He was so deeply moved by their hospitality, he agreed to appear as Santa Claus by gluing cotton on his chin and squeezing into a threadbare Santa suit. So by the time Gene Acker came into his life, he had long since decided it was high time he had his own cozy home. Rudy met Gene shortly after receiving the devastating news of his mother's death, and he gratefully succumbed to Gene's comforting smile and hand-holding abilities during this sorrowful time. His response to her kind-hearted sympathy was an impromptu marriage proposal. In his highly vulnerable state, it made little difference that within the time frame of rational prenuptials, he'd known Gene only a moment. During the weeks prior to his hasty marriage proposal, Rudy found work in the film Once to Every Woman and completed a small appearance in a single scene in another movie titled The Eyes of Youth. Despite securing these roles, he was deep in debt to everyone. His friends, his landlord, his dry cleaner, as well as tailors in Los Angeles and in New York. Nevertheless, when he awoke on his wedding day, he was elated and definitely not worrying about his many unpaid bills. He was well aware Metro Pictures' top brass would all be attending his wedding, and remained overly confident that he was about to at last experience his passage from obscurity in the motion picture industry to stardom and financial reward. But as fate did not have it, only a few hours after the wedding ceremony, he found himself rejected, slogging his way home while watching the sun rise over the city of angels. He consoled himself with the prospect of stopping by a garage on Sunset Boulevard later in the day to do a little mechanical work in exchange for a loaner vehicle. Perhaps, he thought, he would then drive to the beach in Santa Monica to while away the day until Jean finished her work at the studio. He reminded himself that Jean was, in fact, his lawfully wedded wife, but this did little to alter his increasingly sullen mood. He did not spend his first morning as a married man dwelling upon the positive, and he was extremely short of patience as he reviewed his latest misfortunes. There was the sore subject of the recent repossession of his first car, his Mercer raceabout. The monthly loan payment of $50 a month seemed like a fair price when he purchased the vehicle, but acting jobs were few, and too many payments slipped by unpaid. Remembering how meticulously he maintained a Mercer's engine, and how the vehicle cruised along the highway at 100 miles an hour, only added to his depressing state. As he neared the end of his morning's trek, he tried to shake off any lingering torment of his repossessed car and Jean's brutal rejection. By the time he realized he was a few blocks from his apartment, he was thinking only of sleep. He stumbled into the stark rooms he called home, and began his ritual of undressing. His suit coat was hung on its wooden hanger. The hard collars and cuffs were removed from his dress shirt, and his patent leather shoes were buffed to a brilliant shine and slipped into their felt bags. Before going to bed that morning, he sat for a few minutes at a small table to scratch out a poem in honor of his new bride. The young poet, sitting in his underwear, had no way of knowing he would never sleep with his wife, Jean. And as he carefully selected each word and phrase, he had no way of knowing she would tell a friend many years later that she never slept with him on their wedding night because he told her he had gonorrhea. He also had no way of knowing then that it would be rumored Jean was a lesbian, or that a file of documents would one day be discovered in his lawyer's archives revealing her claim of a medical condition which prevented her from ever having sexual intercourse. And on that early morning, as the forlorn bridegroom perused his finished poem, he had no way of knowing that Jean Acker would one day, in the not-too-distant future, be the last woman to see him alive. By the time Rudy married Jean Acker, he had been living in Hollywood for almost 2 years and appeared in a dozen mediocre movies. It is doubtful that any of these films would have received the slightest footnote in cinema history if his name had not appeared in the cast of characters. In most of these early screen roles, he was cast as the stereotypical villainous parlor cad. He knew his dark skin was a liability in the motion picture industry, and for this reason he was typecast from his day one in Hollywood. In his earliest films, his characters were most often smarmy foreign villains such as Count de Francini in The Married Virgin and José Dalmaraz in Stolen Moments. Whenever he did find work in a sympathetic role, his characters were typically anglicized and given names such as Richard Bradley in Society Sensation and Dick Thayer in All Night. When Rudolph Valentino first auditioned for work in front of a movie camera, Italian immigrants were being subjected to widespread discrimination and xenophobic rhetoric. As hundreds of thousands of Italian immigrants flooded into New York's Ellis Island every year, many social movements of the day began adding to the furor by exploiting the public's resentment of the immigrants to further their own causes. Temperance organizations portrayed Italians as violent, excessive drinkers, and fundamentalist Protestants sought to inspire anti-Catholic sentiment by labeling them as, quote, agents of the Pope. Valentino appeared in his first movies at the height of this national immigration crisis, and consequently there was little opportunity for him to be cast in the role of a screen hero. Motion picture executives adamantly believed American audiences would never tolerate the effrontery of an Italian leading man, and were not willing to risk a box office flop to prove otherwise. With many hopelessly prejudiced Americans perceiving Italian immigrants as dirty, aggressive folks who reeked of garlic, Hollywood producers exploited these ready stereotypes as models for perfect film villainy. Prompted to stay in step with the times, they hired a young Italian actor who looked the part. Eager for work, a young Rudy Valentino did his best to please his employers with sufficiently menacing scoundrel appearances. But unlike his foreign predecessors and counterparts, he added a new twist to the predictable theme of screen skullduggery. This variation seemed unavoidable, as Rudy was also disarmingly handsome, sexy, and slick. The fact that most of his early screen roles were denigrating to him personally made little difference to most of the women in his audiences. His physical attractiveness was duly noted, despite his meager performances. On the other hand, men in the audiences shifted in their seats and squirmed at the obvious unsettling female response and not-so-hidden smiles on their dates' glowing faces. For Rudy was hard at work in these insignificant screen roles and deftly and elegantly redeeming every wicked character he played. Despite securing consistent work in the movies, by the end of 1919 he was thoroughly discouraged with his being typecast as the scheming villain. Nevertheless, debt collectors still loitered outside his door, and he was forced to swallow his pride and accept any work in the movies, no matter how demeaning the assignment. By eking out a meager income from his work on screen, he successfully avoided accepting day labor in Frank Manillo's multitude of California businesses. But by the fall of 1919, as Rudy prepared to marry Jean Acker, he was left with no other option but to succeed financially in the movies. Just as his love for Jean Acker was grabbing the attention of some of Hollywood's most influential moguls, Rudy's financial situation took a precarious turn for the worst. His trusty godfather, Frank Manillo, was no longer anyone's wealthy benefactor and had, in fact, gone bankrupt. Frank's catastrophic financial descent in the fall of 1919 resulted from an olive poisoning in the Midwest, which caused the death of several people. This olive poisoning did not involve any of Frank's products or his canning processes, but the panic generated by the devastating episode prompted his financial backer, A.P. Giannini, to call in all of the loans he held on Frank's many businesses. In a desperate effort to raise the capital to repay Giannini, Frank purchased a Packard touring car and hired a chauffeur to ferry him between Los Angeles and San Francisco in order to liquidate all of his business holdings. He closed 11 of his olive canneries, his fish cannery on Terminal Island, his truck and tractor dealership, and a theater in Los Angeles. Ultimately, Frank was unable to raise all of the money he owed A.P. Giannini. The best-loved and best-hated banker in California accepted Frank's partial payment by issuing a vendetta. He would personally see that Frank Manillo never worked another day in California. With a roll of bills totaling a mere $500 in his pocket, the Olive King packed his remaining possessions in several trunks and headed for New York City. With his reliable padrino, Frank Manillo, flat broke, Rudy's financial independence in Hollywood suddenly became a critical necessity. He knew it was imperative he apply himself as an actor, or face the dreaded possibility of a return to economically impoverished southern Italy. Determined to remain in America, he pounded the pavement in search of any screen roles, and dove recklessly into a hasty marriage to Jean Acker. It was just as his wedding gained the attention of Metro's top executives that a casual introduction set the ultimate gambit of his wild success into motion. In his position as press secretary with the famous Players Lasky's studio, Harry Reichenbach was certainly someone to know in Hollywood. Reichenbach was a pioneer in the field of public relations and credited with creating some of the first and most outrageous publicity stunts. In 1918, he orchestrated one of his infamous pranks when he maneuvered a lion hidden in a piano case into a 4-star hotel suite. After 50 pounds of raw meat was ordered by the occupant of the suite, a guest registered as Mr. T.R. Zan, the hotel manager was dispatched to investigate. After Mr. T.R. Zan failed to answer his door, the manager entered the hotel room to find the lion lolling on the bed. As the terrified hotel manager retreated to sound the alarm that a wild beast was on the premises, Harry Reichenbach held a press conference in the hotel lobby to promote the new movie Tarzan, starring Elmo Lincoln. It would be Harry Reichenbach who first suggested to Rudolph Valentino that he contact movie star Clara Kimball Young's manager, Herbert K. Somborn. He told him Somborn was auditioning actors for a small role as a cabaret dancer in her next movie. Rudy acted on Harry Reichenbach's tip and telephoned Somborn to set up the audition. Somborn agreed with Reichenbach's assessment and deemed Rudy a perfect fit for a part in Clara Kimball Young's movie The Eyes of Youth. The upcoming film's storyline revolved around Young's role as a woman who was shown 3 paths for her future in a crystal ball. The script was divided into 3 vignettes, and the particular scene Somborn offered to Rudy was in the 3rd and last segment of the film. Unfortunately, in this particular assignment, Rudy would again portray his most dreaded stereotype of the cabaret parasite. But with his padrino unable to be of any financial assistance, Rudy was in no position to refuse income, and happily accepted the small part. A paycheck from The Eyes of Youth would keep his landlord at bay for a little while. His fear that he might have to go further into debt or rely upon ballroom dancing in order to make ends meet were powerful incentives to accept the lamentable part. It was just as Rudy completed his one scene in The Eyes of Youth that he received news of his mother's death and met Jean Acker. And it was soon after his whirlwind and bitterly disappointing marriage that the film opened in Los Angeles. But by the time The Eyes of Youth was released, Rudy's attention was focused less on his latest small part and more on his ever-evasive new bride. For the entire first month of their married life, Jean had been a frustrating tease, and they had yet to spend a single night together. On December 5th, an unexpected invitation from Jean caught Rudy off guard. Excited by the enticing prospect that she might at last become his wife in every sense of the word, he shared the good news with his friends. However, this much-anticipated night with Jean only resulted in more exasperation, as absolutely nothing happened. Jean complained she didn't feel well, said she was simply exhausted, and left her husband in an even more debilitating state of frustration. As his aggravation over the situation intensified, Metro Pictures loaned the professional services of their contract actress Jean Acker to the famous Players Lasky studio. Jean was sent off to Lone Pine in the Sierra Mountains to film location shots for The Roundup, starring Fatty Arbuckle. She neglected to pass news of her trip along to her frantic husband before leaving town. As soon as Rudy learned of her departure, he wired his wife to inform her that he was utterly miserable. He closed his first missive by imploring they at least spend Christmas together. Jean's wire in return was infuriating in its simplicity, stating, quote, "I cannot promise to visit Christmas, heartbroken, but work before pleasure, be a good boy, remember me every second, Jean," end quote. Rudy fired off his next wire to his wife in Lone Pine, informing her that he was on his way to join her on location. Adamant he would at least spend Christmas with Jean, he boarded a train at the Southern Pacific Arcade Depot and headed north to Inyo County and Bishop, California, the train station located nearest to the Lone Pine set. By the time the train arrived late that afternoon, a recent snow squall had transformed Bishop into a winter wonderland. As Rudy stepped off the train and eyed the pine trees drooping under the weight of the fresh snow, he realized he was woefully underdressed. He quickly made his way to the famous Players Lasky commissary, and as he stomped the snow from his street shoes, he inquired which cabin belonged to his wife Jean Acker. The answer to his question cut through him with a sub-zero chill as cold as the banks of snow outside. Jean Acker was not there. He learned that as soon as his wife finished reading his last telegram, she skipped out of camp and boarded the next train headed for Los Angeles. Rudy refused to believe a word and shouted for all to hear that she must still be there. He crashed about opening doors in a boisterous search for his wife. But Jean had indeed given him the slip. Evidently, by the time Rudy arrived, the Odors character of Miss Polly Hope rushed through her final scene and left. Roundup's extras, cast and crew sympathized with Rudy's rage at his wife's hasty departure. The film's director, George Melford, offered him some sage advice by saying, "Hey kid, calm down and have something to eat." But with the next train not scheduled to leave for Los Angeles until the following morning, Rudy had no choice but to sit out the night sipping hot coffee and eating ham and egg sandwiches. By dawn, he stood shivering at the Bishop train station, reeling from yet another fresh wound of humiliation suffered at the delicate hands of his illusory wife. The return trip down through the mountain passes was a tedious ride, which did nothing to calm his agitated state of mind. By the time the train slowed into the Los Angeles Arcade Depot, the sandwiches he'd stuffed in his pockets and his patience were long gone. He had once again worked himself into a seething fury. Indeed, at some point during the train's chugging across the interminable miles, he abandoned any illusion that he was actually a married man. And before the train could come to the screeching halt in Los Angeles, Rudy was sprinting across the station platform, hell-bent on finding Jean. He knew exactly where to find her, at her friend Grace Darman's home. Grace was also a Metro actress who lived with her mother in Hollywood, and Rudy knew Jean was a permanent guest in their home. On that fateful afternoon, Grace Darman's mother answered a loud rapping on the front door to find a furious Rudolph Valentino standing before her. With no explanation for his sudden appearance, he rushed past the startled woman and stomped up the hall stairs towards Grace's second-floor apartment. Before Grace's mother could call out to alert her daughter, Rudy burst through the door and stormed into the parlor. At the sight of the rumpled and unshaven Rudy, Grace let out a shriek. "Jean, it's Rudy." Grace attempted to stand her ground and ordered Rudy to sit down. "She's in the bath, Rudy. I'll tell her you're here." Hearing her husband's thunderous entrance, Jean called out to him from the bathroom. The moment Rudy heard her voice, he charged across the parlor and began slamming his fist on the bathroom door. This time, Jean made the mistake of opening it. She was in the process of tying a robe around her dripping self when he burst through that door. Before she could say another word or raise a finger in self-defense, he leveled a fierce backhand across the side of her face, which sent her sprawling onto the bathroom's tiled floor. Jean cowered by the bathtub, anticipating her husband's next strike. To her surprise, he dissolved into instant remorse, helped her to her feet, and began pleading for her forgiveness. While the side of her face grew swollen and beet red, he explained how he had been traveling for 2 days and was so distraught that she had left Lone Pine. His attempt to plead his case ended abruptly when Grace rushed to Jean's defense, and Grace's mother grabbed Rudy by the back of his coat. As she began yanking him out of the bathroom, he yelled over his shoulder to Jean, "It's Christmas time. You are my wife, and I only wanted to spend the holidays with you." Grace's mother responded for Jean by saying, "Young man, if you do not leave immediately, I will call the police." Despite Rudy's protest, she tugged away, hauling him through the parlor, down the stairs, and out the front door, which she slammed loudly behind him. Metro Pictures soon issued a formal press release announcing the separation of Jean Acker and Rudolph Valentino, and dated the couple's separation December 6th. No mention was made of the botched attempt at a reunion in Lone Pine. Rudy wasted no time mourning his fiasco of a marriage and occupied his time with an urgent search for work on screen and the enjoyment of his burgeoning social life. During the first few weeks after his separation from Jean, he traveled with friends to Palm Springs, where he met another aspirant in the motion picture industry, cameraman Paul Ivanichevich. Ivanichevich would soon change his name to Paul Ivano and become one of Rudy's closest friends. Despite his growing list of influential friends, consistent and lucrative work for Rudy in Hollywood continued to be elusive. With his godfather Frank Manillo sending news that he was stabilizing himself financially in New York, Rudy decided to follow suit in the hopes of securing better roles in movies being produced on the East Coast. On the train ride east, he whiled away the long hours perusing the popular novel by Vicente Ibanez, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Along with every other actor in Hollywood, he knew that Metro Pictures was about to convert the best-selling book into a major motion picture, and he was determined to audition for any possible role in the highly publicized production. Although Rudy was still legally a married man by the time he reached New York City, he felt absolutely no allegiance to his marriage vows and enjoyed the company of female friends as an exhilarating escape from the disappointments of the past few months. Pining for Jean Acker had taken up enough of his precious time. The Eyes of Youth had been playing in theaters for a few weeks before Metro Pictures head screenwriter June Mathis attended an afternoon showing. She hoped to review the film and report her professional opinion to her boss, Metro President Richard Rowland. As the theater orchestra played the closing strains of their opening overture, and the Eyes of Youth finally flickered into focus, June Mathis relaxed in her seat and paid close attention. About 2/3 of the way through the movie, one bit actor caught her eye, Rudolph Valentino. He played the character of Clarence Morgan, a handsome yet nefarious cabaret dancer. According to the script, Clarence Morgan was paid a substantial amount of cash by the film heroine's husband to engage her in an incriminating situation which would provide him with grounds for a divorce. The plot thickens when Clarence Morgan lays his trap for the heroine after arriving at a roadside inn and checking in to room number A4. There he telephones the heroine, Gina, to inform her that her husband has been seriously injured in a car accident. He concludes the brief call by adding that he is the doctor attending to her injured husband. Gina wastes no time speeding to her husband's side. Meanwhile, in room A4, Clarence Morgan prepares for his victim's arrival by removing his tie and pouring himself a stiff drink. When the panicky Gina arrives, Morgan greets her at the door, and without her knowledge locks the door behind her back. When she does not immediately see her husband, he explains he is being examined by another physician in an adjoining room. Gina gets her first whiff of the rat when Morgan offers her a drink and stands far too close for her comfort. When she turns to escape, she discovers the door is locked. At this point, Morgan assaults the poor woman. While Gina struggles valiantly against her assailant, her husband, accompanied by the inn's manager, hears the fracas and takes his cue. He pounds on the door as she calls out desperately for her husband. This is Clarence Morgan's cue to lean in with even more force upon the traumatized woman and tear her dress from her shoulder. The fabric rips, and Gina is left screaming, fully exposed and fumbling to cover her breasts. Unfazed, Morgan presses his hand over her mouth and calls out, "Darling, I know you love me, but what of your husband?" Hearing the woman's screams, the inn's manager batters down the door to discover the half-nude and horrified Gina. And this was the end of the steamy little scene and the extent of Rudy's 6 minutes of work in The Eyes of Youth. Now, the producers of The Eyes of Youth hoped their audiences would react to the character of Clarence Morgan with horror and repugnance. To their astonishment, Rudolph Valentino's portrayal of the character generated the opposite effect. His 6 minutes of lechery consistently inspired a collective gasp from theater audiences, and even more surprisingly, women were paying to watch the torrid scene over and over. June Mathis may have had much the same reaction. But unlike other women in the audience, she had an eye for undeveloped talent and noticed something in Rudolph Valentino's brief performance. She also wielded considerable influence at Metro Pictures, had the power to act upon her reaction, and promptly did so. At the time, she was negotiating her way through the early production stages of Metro's The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, the story of an Argentine playboy who, through a series of political and domestic twists and turns, ends up living in Paris and dying on the battlefield during World War I. The saga of the story's main character, Julio Desnoyers, is set against a backdrop of the war and his family's struggle as he and his relatives find themselves fighting on both sides of the conflict. When June Mathis presented Metro Pictures president Richard Rowland with her screenplay for the film version of the Ibanez novel, he was so impressed he granted her complete authority to hire cast, crew, and director. True to form, most of June's selections for Four Horsemen's cast and crew were as controversial as the book itself. She selected an unknown, Rex Ingram, as director, and it was only after much debate that Richard Rowland finally approved this nomination. Immediately after watching Rudy's 6 minutes in The Eyes of Youth, June telephoned Metro's offices with more alarming news for Richard Rowland. "Richard, I found my Julio." As was the case with her choice of director, June was forced to argue for her choice for the film's leading actor. Richard Rowland recalled Rudolph Valentino as Gene Acker's scorned husband and knew only a little about his unimpressive work in a string of minor films. He thought June was off the mark and told her in no uncertain terms that he didn't feel Valentino had enough screen experience to handle such a complex and challenging role. June stood her ground and told Rowland she would personally coach young Valentino through every scene if necessary. With this assurance, Rowland relented and granted his approval. While June Mathis was arguing her case, her new discovery was completing his scenes in the film Stolen Moments and about to begin work in The Wonderful Chance with director George Archambaud. Rudy had no idea why he was suddenly called off the set and summoned to meet with Metro president Richard Rowland. He was only informed that all of his impending scenes were to be filmed as soon as possible, as the studio needed him in Los Angeles as soon as possible. When Rudy arrived at Metro Pictures' New York executive offices, the receptionist had no idea who he was and blithely asked if he had an appointment. He replied that Mr. Rowland sent for him and took a seat as the woman shuffled off to announce his arrival. She soon returned and motioned for Rudy to follow her through a pair of imposing office doors. Richard Rowland stepped out from behind his desk to shake Rudy's hand. "Rudolph, Miss June Mathis wants to cast you in the role of Julio in The Four Horsemen." Still clutching the executive's hand, Rudy stumbled forward a step to ask Richard Rowland if he could please repeat what he had just said. Rowland thought he detected tears welling in the actor's dark eyes. He had. Overcome by the news, Rudy lowered his head and let out an audible sob. At this point, Rowland felt their handshake continuing just a bit too long and pulled back. From a safe distance behind his desk, he made an effort to restore some sense of decorum. "You will be returning to California as soon as you conclude your current obligations here on the East Coast. There will be a car and a driver waiting for you when you arrive at the train station in Los Angeles, and a suite will be leased in your name at the Hollywood Hotel. And Rudolph, buy a new suit." Rudy purchased more than Richard Rowland's recommended new suit before he left New York. He went directly to Manhattan's Lower West Side garment district, where he ensconced himself in the shop of one of New York's finest certified master tailors. He proceeded to sort through bolts of wool flannel, Scotch and Harris tweeds, and order an entire wardrobe of custom-made suits and jackets. Severely trying the tailor's patience, he nitpicked his way through the minutiae of cuff details, lapel design, and trouser length, and paid far too much attention to the infinitesimal workings of the perfect fit. The tailor was accustomed to accommodating a demanding clientele, but he had never met anyone as seriously invested in the creation of his apparel as Rudy. Despite his obsessive weighing of each and every decision, progress was eventually made, and after hours of grueling measuring, Rudy's order was at last complete. It was at that point that he made several last-minute purchases: sweaters, silk ties, bow ties, shirts of every color, in putty, peach, blue-gray, and cedar, in addition to an alpaca overcoat, a silk top hat, and a Borsalino fedora of beaver fur. Rudy's eclectic taste astonished the tailor, as he usually catered to a more conservative clientele. The tailor surmised correctly that when it came to the subject of personal attire, Rudy was no stuffed shirt. After all, he came from southern Italy, where men wore brightly colored shirts and jewelry as a sign of personal style and success. However, this was not the accepted practice in America at the time, and Rudy's predilection for loud shirts and uncommon accessories was about to challenge the staid male establishment's imperative that men's fashions be distinguished and appropriately conformist. As Rudy selected his colorful shirts that day, he was indeed naive to the fact that beauty had but one gender in American society. A well-tailored suit was one thing, but garish shirts, wristwatches, and jewelry were another issue entirely. Nevertheless, Rudy ordered a few more ear-splitting ties, while the exasperated tailor turned his attention to the task of preparing an invoice for this wardrobe extraordinaire. As he tallied, Rudy informed him that he was charging all of these purchases on credit, and that the entire order should be delivered to his suite at the Hollywood Hotel in Hollywood, California. By the tailor's long face and silent response, Rudy could see he would have to sell this proposition, and he started talking. "If you would telephone Mr. Richard Rowland at Metro Pictures, he will guarantee my payment. All of these suits and shirts will be borne by me in the motion picture The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse." Before the tailor put his pen back to paper, he raised an eyebrow and inquired, "You will be appearing in this picture?" "Yes, I will play Julio," Rudy answered. "Do you know the book?" The tailor had indeed read the Ibanez novel and did not answer. He was already scribbling down the delivery information and closing his mighty sale. Julio then grabbed the receipt, shook the tailor's hand, and left. Rudy's transformation into the character of the macho, vainglorious Argentine Julio Desnores was already well underway. The role of the handsome young hero who tragically dies young had been perfectly cast. Thanks for listening, and my next installment will be Chapter 3, titled Calling the Shots. I hope you will subscribe to this podcast so you will be notified when the next chapter goes online. As always, you may find a copy of Affairs Valentino on Amazon and all online book selling venues.